Good afternoon and Happy New Year to everyone. I hope you had a nice holiday break and were able to enjoy some time with family and friends. This is Christina Osborne with the ISO Stakeholder Engagement Team, and on behalf of the ISO, I'd like to welcome you to the first meeting to kick off Working Group 1 of the Extended Day Ahead Market, or EDAM initiative. This working group will focus specifically on the supply commitment and resource sufficiency evaluation topics. Mark Richardson, who is an account manager here at the ISO, will be facilitating the Working Group 1 discussions, and then Bob Cott, ISO's Operations Policy Manager, will be the scribe. This working group will meet weekly on Mondays and Wednesdays, starting today through the week March 14th. The ISO hosted a meeting on December 16th. Just wanted to let everybody know, I do hear some background noise. What we decided to do is actually keep the phone lines open for all participants during this meeting. So just a friendly reminder to mute your lines unless you do have a question or comment later on in the discussion. So the ISO did host a meeting on December 16th to review the organization and logistics for these working group meetings. So if you want more information on how these working groups are structured, I do encourage you to review the presentation or listen to the meeting recording for that December 16th meeting. So those materials are posted on the EDAM initiative webpage. And so we'll go to our agenda. So after I review the logistics, I'm going to turn the meeting over to Mark Richardson to provide background and review the principles specific to this working group. And he'll open the group, he'll ask the group to review, prioritize the initial list of scope items for the supply commitment and RFC topics. And then at the end of the meeting, Bob Cott will provide a recap of the discussion, and then Mark will go over topics for the meeting. We do have several other ISO representatives on this call who are assigned to this initiative. They are logged in as panelists shown on the upper right side of the screen. I won't read off all of their. As for the meeting participation and logistics, these are collaborative working groups, and they're intended to foster open dialogue and sharing of ideas and perspectives. Therefore, active participation is critical to meet the objectives. The purpose of these working group meetings is to have constructive and inclusive discussions. We do ask that you please respect the opinions of others. The phone lines will remain open throughout the meetings to enable open dialogue. However, similar to our other stakeholder meetings, we do ask that you raise your hand if you do have any questions or comments to help better manage the meeting and discussion. And stakeholders are welcome to present perspectives at these meetings, so the next slide includes a link for how to notify the ISO are interested in presenting. So this slide includes a link to resources, EDAM resources, starting with a link to the common EDAM design principles and concepts which have been discussed in previous forums, and this can also be found on the main EDAM webpage. And we've also provided links to the individual working group web pages. So any information related to a particular working group will be available on the associated web page. These links can also be found on the main EDAM initiative web page. We did create an online form where you can submit questions and inquiries related to the working groups. There's a section in the form to also let us know if you're presenting at an upcoming meeting. For those who are interested, presentation will be 5 business days prior to the meeting that you are present at. We do encourage you to register for the working group meetings. It helps us gauge interest and facilitate communication throughout the process. I did send an email Thursday of last week with information related to these the working group meetings that are kicking off this week. So if you did receive that email, then you have successfully registered. If not, you're welcome to reach out to me, and I'll check to see if you are on the registration list. We are recording all of the working group meetings, and we'll post those video files on the related web pages for informational and convenience purposes. As a reminder, please contact the ISO before reprinting any related transcriptions. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn our meeting over to Mark Richardson.
Thank you, Christina. Can you confirm you hear me okay?
I can hear you.
All right. Good afternoon, team, and I look forward to these next few months working with everyone. So first, I'd like to lay out today's objectives. We're going to provide a quick background and review of the relevant principles for our working group. We're going to pull up the list of scope items that were provided back on the 16th of December, and we're going to review, modify, and really discuss that list. We're going to decide on how we should tackle the various topics and if there's a logical order to walk through them. And then really set the stage for Wednesday's discussion so that everyone has time to ponder some ideas and thoughts prior to that meeting to kind of help in an engaged, robust conversation. Next slide, please. All right, so as you are all aware, the ISO has discussed these principles in prior EDAM forums, but I really wanted to start today's meeting with an overview of the relevant common EDAM design principles as initial guides for this policy discussion. For background, these principles were developed by a subset of EIM entities and California PTOs over the summer in an effort to restart the more detailed design discussions that we're going to have through this EDAM initiative and really through these working groups today. I do want to note and emphasize that these are considered initial principles to help guide our discussions, and as we dive into those details, there will be an opportunity to consider revisions. So with that, I'm going to read verbatim what was previously provided around those EDAM principles and around RSE, that is. So with that, the RSE should ensure that entering the day-ahead market, EDAM entities can meet their individual capacity and other balancing authority area obligations based on conditions expected in the day-ahead timeframe and in order to prevent leaning on other EDAM entities. Again, common design principle around EDAM is the prevention of leaning. We want to make sure everyone's adequate prior to participating in EDAM. Heading into the next principle, participation in EDAM, including meeting the EDAM RSE, should not modify state or local control over long-term RA planning and integrated resource planning or any other aspect of state or local generation planning and certification. So we're not looking to alter or modify any RA programs in other states or governance. The RSE recognizes that different resource planning and resource adequacy programs of EDAM entities and resources complying with those programs could count toward meeting the RSE. So as we get into some of these detailed discussions here in a little bit, we recognize that there's different qualifications across, the potential EDAM footprint, or across the West, I should say, that may be different depending on which state the resource resides in, and we need to make sure we're accounting for that in this RSE design. Let me pause there to see if we have any questions or comments. I know we also have a few representatives who were part of those subset of entities that came up with these principles, and I don't know if they wanted to provide any additional context.
Yeah, and if you do have a question, if you've logged into WebEx, select the hand icon above the chat window at the top right. If you just dialed into the meeting, press #2 on your phone. And please start by introducing yourself. It looks like we do have Carrie Bentley with her hand raised. Carrie, go ahead.
Hear me?
Carrie, go ahead. Your line's unmuted.
Oh, hi, this is Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. I'd appreciate some clarification on how 1 and 2 interrelate. If you're defining leaning as having relevant resources for day ahead, or having it day ahead plus a buffer, something more aligned with resource adequacy requirement must offer rules.
Yeah, so thank you for the question, Carrie, and Happy New Year. So part of the initial scope items is actually going to be, defining leaning in this context. So I'm actually going to save that question, if that's okay, for when we dive into those scope items, because that is important heading into the RSE.
Yeah, and it would be really helpful if you could, as part of that, explain what the initial guiding principles meant. I wasn't part of the conversation, so it's just unclear to me even where our starting point is. Thanks, Mark.
All right. Cathy, I believe you're on the line, and we had a few back and forth. Do you mind chiming in as far as context around the intent behind this leaning principle?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead. Thank you.
So, and I am not the resource sufficiency expert by any means in any of these conversations. So The leaning principle is really just, to, again, ensure that everyone is doing their appropriate procurement ahead of time to make sure that you are sufficient, and then allowing the market to optimize those out in those that are bid into the market as just basically to optimize those. Now, there's various different things that I think the work group can look at, and I don't know if Kevin Smith is on, he might be able to address this a little bit better, but, it could be, if somebody is not completely sufficient, is there a financial impact where they still have, able to participate in the market, but they have a financial penalty per se? Is there, it comes down to what is the impact if you are not able to fully be sufficient to serve your load, your forecasted load? I'm not sure if that helps answer the question or not. If not, maybe Kevin Smith can help out as well.
Hey, Cathy, this is Kevin. Can you hear me okay? Because I've got a weird headset, and I hope it's coming through.
Loud and clear, Kevin.
Okay, cool. Yeah, hi, I'm Kevin with Bank. I think actually the issue, the second bullet, and I'll kind of focus on that, and I see a relationship between the second and third even more so, but I think the idea was one of the first concepts that we talked about as a group. This goes way back, not over the summer, but just the initial idea is that we don't want EDAM becoming the tail wagging the dog. There are existing structures in various regions, multiple commissions and governing entities. I mean, we're governed by a commission, but we have individual boards and so forth. And I think the idea was that EDAM is not going to be responsible for dictating how individual entities meet their procurement obligations. And so that's really what the second bullet was focused on. And I would expect over time, and this is all part of the discussion we're going to have, but I would expect that, a lot of decisions that have been made in the past, we're not going into this trying to unwind contracts and other things that have been made and are being relied upon for reliability purposes and for meeting RSE in this case. So that's not the purpose of this, but I would imagine over time, as we, let's assume that we move forward with an EDAM, there will be a convergence of, these planning and other things around whatever those test principles ultimately are. And so we would expect over time that this does produce some kind of a convergence, but it's not the intent to start on day one and start revisiting everybody's existing arrangements. But again, I mean, going back, Carrie, to your question, the relationship there is, we're fundamentally, we can't be leaning on the market. So there can be some tension there. And if to the extent there are arrangements that are not ultimately reliable, I mean, I guess that's where all these things start coming together. So, but I think we were just trying to state general concepts. This isn't the details. The details are yet to be determined.
Thank you, Kevin and Cathy. I appreciate that context. All right, let's move on to the next slide. And kind of going back to what Kevin stated, we are going to have detailed discussion through these forms on those details, right? These are just guiding principles. As I stated earlier, they may modify organically based on those discussions, and we're definitely open to that.
So Mark, before we move on, I just want to make sure we've addressed Carrie's questions because her hand is still raised, and then we also have Stuart Kelly in the queue.
All right, go ahead, Carrie.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I'm just not used to this format and forgot to lower my hand. But thank you for the discussion. I found it helpful to understand the beginning stages of the discussion. Thanks.
Stuart, go ahead.
A quick question on bullet one, and maybe Kevin, you can answer this. In bullet one, it mentions other meeting other balancing authority area obligations. What exactly is in scope with other balancing authority area obligations, and what is intended to be measured? I don't know if the discussions went that deep, Kevin, or this is just a kind of generic statement really leading to the recognition in bullet 3. Maybe you can give some context on that piece.
Yeah, Stuart, thanks. I think it's kind of the latter. It's a little more of a high-level concept. We all know that there are various obligations, whether it's reserve sharing or other things that, you know, we're members of the Northwest Power Pool reserve sharing, and others are part of reserve sharing groups. There are just numerous overlapping obligations that affect our reliability and our day in, day out obligations as balancing authorities. So I think it was a general expression.
Understood. That's helpful. Thanks, Kevin.
Yeah, sure.
Hi, this is Michelle Keto. Could everyone identify who they are and who they represent? It's really much more helpful. It's helpful to understand, you know, people's where they're from.
Stuart Kelly.
Go ahead, Stuart.
Stuart Kelly, LEDWP.
Thank you.
And this is Kevin Smith. I'm with Balancing Authority in Northern California.
Great, thank you.
All right, Christina, did we have anyone else in the queue?
I don't see anybody else.
All right, so moving on to the next set of relevant guiding principles. We decided, jointly, there needs to be transparent and equitable application of the RSE across all EDAM entities. So what that actually looks like, we will get into, I know Dani Johnson, the lead policy developer, published his initial set of scope items, and he has a few ideas there. I definitely look forward to the community engagement on that to see what others believe, what that means. Next item here is failure to meet EDAM RSE should carry incentive-based consequences for the failing EDAM entity to ensure confidence of EDAM transfers and prevent leaning among other EDAM entities. And then lastly, kind of piggybacking on the one prior, is we need to identify the certainty around these transfers, right? Transfers identified through EDAM are considered firm energy transfers and can be relied upon different operating conditions, or different conditions, excuse me. And, what those conditions look like, how we define those conditions will be worked out through that scope item list. So Kevin, I don't know if you wanted to provide any additional context there, thoughts or comments?
It sounds like somebody had a question already.
Yeah. So this is Michelle Keto, and I just wanted to ask a little question about the failure of the EDAM RSE. So one of the things that has been coming up in the EIM RSE is that it's possible that California fails because of exports. Right now, California can take back the exports if they're non-RA resources. So how do you guys imagine that this would work with RA resources? So let's say we clear the market, but we clear exports that are based on our California RA resources. Are you saying that we wouldn't be able to take those back as we can today?
So I'm going to jump in here, Kevin. So thank you for the question, Michelle. So that question and those details are exactly what we're going to be working out through that scope list item, right? What level of priority they have and when in the market should those be pulled back or not.
Okay, thanks. Okay, thank you.
Hey, Mark,
no
this is
problem.
Cathy.
Great question.
Cathy at Idaho Power. I just wanted to point out that as you're having those conversations, you need to think of it as a broader picture of the entire market, because if California can pull theirs back, then can Idaho Power also pull theirs back? And then at that point in time, how much are the transfers that are set a day ahead even worth?
So this is Michelle, and I have thought about this, and I would just say that the difference between the California market and potentially other BAAs is that other BAs might be vertically integrated and can hold back resources from the day-ahead market to make sure that they serve their load, whereas California doesn't. So, you know, RE resources have a must offer. They can't hold them back for the next day, right?
Yeah, I think it's just one that just makes sure as you're creating the policies, we need to be really thoughtful in that and spell it out very clearly on what entities can do what. So.
Right. And also just recognize that the entities might have different markets, right? So California has a market where all the resources must be made available if they're resource adequacy, which means that they can be available for export, which is maybe not the case in other balancing authorities. So just so long as we keep that in mind, that we have different systems, that would be great. Thank you.
And we do have a couple of people in the queue. I just want to remind everyone, if you could raise your hand before commenting, that would be helpful just so we could help manage the flow. So let's go ahead and go to Bobby. And Bobby, just if you can introduce yourself and who you're affiliated with, please.
Yeah, so this is Bobby Olson with SRP, and I was in the conversations with Cathy and several others on this, and appreciate the dialogue that was going on. I just wanted to kind of comment on the intention behind ensuring that the transfers were firm is recognizing that as you're optimizing across multiple balancing areas, you are causing decommitments of resources that those balancing areas, including CAISO, would otherwise be dependent upon. And so the concept behind this was about creating the incentive for everybody to be willing to rely and depend upon the transfers here. So I look forward to the conversation. I think it's going to be a good conversation, but really wanting to make sure that participation is robust, and part of that participation will require a consideration regarding firmness of transfers and whether or not that means that entities will participate as much as we would all hope they can. So.
Bobby. All right, we'll go to the next person in the queue. Jeff?
Good afternoon, everyone. It's Jeff Nelson from SCE. Michelle, I wanted to chime in too. Some of the conversations we had was, in addition to everything that was being said about the market being able to count on something once they bought it. You know, we had a discussion about, well, how's RA going to work with all this? Again, it's going to be sort of a very, very robust conversation. But one of the sort of the hypotheticals came up was that let's just take it from California's perspective. They're going to have to make sure that they're comfortable that if they commit to an export, that they'll honor it. And that leaves the question of, well, what does it mean to be comfortable that you can actually honor an export? And the conversation actually went that there may be situations where California is not comfortable honoring exports because, for example, they need to keep resource adequacy because of uncertainty, conditions, variability, whatever, and there may not be exports available. So we'll discuss more, but yeah, really making sure that if we commit to something, we can live up to it, but that doesn't mean we make commitments lightly. But again, we'll have much more discussion as this working group goes forward.
Thank you, Jeff. Kathleen?
Hi, great. Thank you. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I have a question about the second bullet as well, but I think it's a slightly different one. Perhaps not. But so kind of taking a step away from that dialogue, I just wanted to make sure I'm catching the specific meaning behind the incentive-based consequences. So like for the real-time EIM RSE, I think we're still kind of exploring whether when there's failure, it's a cap on your transfer versus if there was openness to kind of more of a scarcity price approach. I know that was in scope of that project. So I just wanted to make sure I wasn't missing this, if that's what I'm supposed to be understanding, is that the principle here is on that specific question for a day ahead time frame, the group's thinking is that incentive based, so more of a scarcity pricing or some kind of price signal is sufficient, whereas maybe the question's still open for real time. So incentive based for the day ahead, the test in the real time might have a stricter failure consequence. depending on what that separate initiative decides. But am I catching what we're supposed to be grasping from the incentive-based words here accurately?
Hey, Kathleen. Oh, go ahead, Dani.
Yeah, this is Dani. I think that you're highlighting something really important, and that it's that leaning is different in the context of EDAM and the context of EIM. Somebody who would fill the RSC in the EIM timeframe has really limited options to procure that energy that they might need to meet their obligations, other than through maybe emergency energy assistance. So I think when we were considering consequences for failure in the EIM context, we wanted to try to basically take that the emergency energy procurement and see if there was a better way to do that through the EIM, while also not allowing the EIM to be used to access that energy without that extra compensation. For EDAM, I think that we want to have a design that would incentivize people to be resource sufficient and recognize that following EDAM, there is an interim time between when EDAM is run and when the EIM would be run the following day, where additional procurement could be done if necessary. I hope that helps.
No, that does help. So that's what I was hearing and connecting. So having you reaffirm that is really helpful. I think conceptually it's hitting me as making sense. I'll think more on it, but I can see how, since there's more time between day ahead and real time, to correct any kind of deficiencies, that not a less strict failure consequence makes sense to me intuitively, but I'll keep thinking about it. But thank you so much, Dani, for helping me to make sure I wasn't missing something that was there. Great. Thank you. Carrie?
Hey, this is Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. I'm going to try again maybe at my question, because I think it was a little dumber and more fundamental than you guys took it. I'm just wondering if in the initial guiding principles, the intent is it almost to be all or nothing, or are the EIM entities and EDAM entities going to get to choose the amount of load that they're participating? Is it supposed to be the CAISO is going to optimize the entire load, the entire BAA within the day ahead market? Or is it there's going to be a portion that they're going to bid into the day ahead, and that's what has to be covered by their supply? And I ask this because in California, load doesn't have to bid in 100% in the day ahead market. They could save some to real time. Likewise, our RA obligations and our must offer changes between day ahead. I mean, it's confusing to me to even talk about this without understanding whether the intent is for everyone now to bid in everything in the day ahead market, or whether that optionality is still going to exist.
So, Carrie, this is Dani. At least the way I've thought of this is the RSC would be a check to make sure that entities could meet their forecasted obligations. Whether they choose to participate to that full amount in the day-ahead market, I think, is still an open question that we need to talk through.
So it's not a check of whether it's being bid in, it's just a check of whether it exists?
I think this would be a check of whether it exists.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful.
Okay, next.
Can I respond to that? It's Jeff Nelson again from SCE.
Sure.
The concept is it's all or nothing. The concept is if you're an EDAM participant, you're participating with all of your load. It's not like I've got 7,000 megawatts of load, and one day I'm going to participate with 1,000 megawatts, and then the next day I'm going to participate with 3,000, and the next day it's 7. No, it's 7,000 all the time. Now, how much of that actually clears the market or not, that's going to be based on bidding, right? People can bid curves, but it's not this discretionary throttle how much of your balancing authority or your load is participating. It's all or nothing. I think that got to your core question.
It does, and I think that's an important thing to think about, because we don't have that obligation in the IFM today. It's all cleared through RUC. So I think it's important up front when you define leaning to say what has to be bid in, what's going to be covered by RUC, and think about that in the context of leaning. But that's really helpful.
It also gets complicated with virtual bidding, right?
Yeah,
I think that's another issue on, I don't know where it ultimately gets addressed, on virtual bidding outside of California.
So Jeff, I agree that's something that we'll need to work through. And if I'm hearing you right, I think it aligns with my understanding is that all of the load will participate in the EDAM for settlement purposes. How much of that is bid into day ahead, and then how much of that is exposed to real-time prices, I think would be the discussion point. Am I understanding you correctly?
It might be more precise how much of it is cleared in the day ahead. And I think it's important to expand too that similarly with resources, to the extent that resources are capable of participating, it's again supposed to be all or nothing, not of my 7,000 megawatts of generation. Back to my example, some days 1,000 megawatts will bid into EDAM or participate in EDAM, and other days 3,000. Now it's whatever's capable of participating. It's all or nothing. That's the concept. It's not sort of a sliding scale of I'm sort of in today, I'm completely in tomorrow, and I'm not in at all the day after. You're in all the time with everything.
Yeah, and I think my point was adding a nuance to that and dividing the day ahead market up between the IFM and the RUC, because I think there's important pricing consequences to saying, yes, you could participate in the day ahead, but you could wait till the RUC run. And so that was just my nuance on Jeff's point.
Okay, just
right. And I think ultimately these are things that we need to work through, but in the context of the RSE, we're just simply testing supply, not how much load is participating.
Let's go ahead and go to Jeff Spires.
Good afternoon. It's Jeff Spires with PowerX. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, hi, Jeff.
Yep.
Hi there. Just a couple of comments based on the discussion so far. First of all, I think it is good to start with the principles and really make sure that we have a robust discussion about those, not only in the context of resource sufficiency, but all of the different topics. I think, just listening to the last discussion between Carrie and Jeff around basically what amounts to the participation requirements and, whether the market is voluntary and to what extent versus a must-offer obligation. I think those are obviously important discussions that are high level, and I think there should be clarity and agreement on elements of the design like that are pretty fundamental to what EDAM is. So I think it's really important to try to stay as high level as we can on some of these important areas. And to that end, in terms of resource sufficiency, something that Bobby mentioned earlier resonated with me about the unit commitment or decommitting resources, which I think it might be worth just taking a step back and thinking a little bit about what resource sufficiency is trying to achieve on a day-ahead basis, because I think it does play a really important role from a number of different perspectives that we should be thinking about when we're developing principles and ultimately the design. And the number one is reliability. If I think we all sort of recognize that one of the primary drivers of benefits on a day-ahead basis is centralized unit commitment and getting a more efficient commitment of resources. But that naturally means that some entities are going to have less resources committed than they otherwise might have done on their own on a standalone basis. And so to be able to access those benefits, they have to be able to rely on others in other BAs to deliver on that supply and ensure that they can count on the market solution as part of meeting their load obligations. So reliability, I think, is such an important part of a day-ahead RS test. We have to keep that in mind. And that's in addition to, I think, the one that's been raised on the slides already, the equity issue and the preventing leaning. And the last element just being trying to find a way to benefit from resource efficiency through diversity, and doing that in a way that is fair, equitable, and that everyone feels comfortable with. So there's multiple benefits and multiple needs for resource efficiency that I think need to inform the design. The last comment I'll make is just to some of Kevin's points earlier. I think it's understood that resource efficiency, one of the objectives is not to infringe upon forward planning structures, resource adequacy, et cetera. But I think on the other hand, it's also important to recognize that part of the need for a resource efficiency test in the first place is to allow for multiple different approaches, forward planning frameworks to come together and to have a common standard and an agreed upon framework to measure, did all of these various approaches and these different entities that are coming to the table day ahead, did they do that? Did their forward planning approaches meet the criteria that we've all set out so that we can be confident that everyone's bringing a sufficient amount of supply to the market? And so it might be that while we're not modifying those forward programs, some forward programs might need to be supplemented with, for example, additional market purchases. As you get closer to the day ahead time frame, it might be that some VAs have less supply than they would need, and they would need to make market purchases to support whatever their forward planning paradigm is. So I think, just wanted to point that out, that I think that there is a tension there between trying to fully allow each forward planning paradigm to continue to exist, but also recognizing that there needs to be a commitment to come to the table with enough supply on a day ahead basis, and that's going to require some common criteria that we all agree to.
Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate those comments, and those details we absolutely will work out, for those forward planning. Are we going to be, is a result of those detailed discussions going to harmonize and have more of a equitable RA program across the West? How these conversations impact that forward procurement, I think will naturally vet that out. I see multiple hands up: Stuart, Kevin, Kathleen. If you guys don't mind lowering your hand unless you have another question. Stuart, did you have a question? Oh.
I can leave it to the end. I can't lower my hand. Just a general point, and I know that we're focused here on RSC, and I get in the timelines, that's what we need to do. I think, as I mentioned to Dani in a previous call in December, there's some contextual stuff that has been discussed, and the issue paper didn't get updated, didn't get aligned to the working groups, and it may be a miss from a CAISO perspective. I mean, there's fundamentals like must-have for obligation that I would have thought at least would be discussed in the principle, from a principle standpoint. So I think that will slow progress without that update or some discussion around how we deal with what was discussed and said before that guided some of these principles. If we need to go straight into RSE, I appreciate that given the timelines, but some folks are going to be disadvantaged because they weren't party to those conversations.
Thank you, Stuart. All right, I don't see any other hands in the queue. So with that, Christina, can we go to the next slide? All right, so let's, we kind of already started going there, but now I would like to pull up the initial list of scope items. What I want to do today is really review and get into the details, make sure everyone agrees that, hey, this is something that we should absolutely vet out in this working group, see if there's any other items we should be considering. If there's any questions, I have Dani Johnson on the line who kind of built this initial list. We posted this back on the 16th, so I really hope everyone had an opportunity to review and come prepared to discuss with those questions. When I went through this list of scope items as the facilitator, I really kind of broke it down into 3 main subcategories, I'm going to call them. One was around the advisory showing. What's the intent? What's the design going to look like? What level of transparency are we going to have? Obviously, the RSC, timing, qualifications of resources, and ramifications for not passing. And then lastly, EDAM transfers, priority and certainty around those transfers. You know, what type of events, what type of priority are those going to have in the real-time market as we roll over from EDAM to real-time. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bob Cott, who is our scribe, to pull up the list, and we will start walking through each item individually.
Michelle, can you give Bob presenting rights, please?
Absolutely, one moment.
Thank you. Bob, just to make sure you're connected via the audio.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Thank you.
Hey, Christina, this is Kathleen Colbert
Okay,
from
can you guys see that?
I had my hand up and I put it back down. Is this a good time? I had a high-level question on the scope, or do you want me to wait for the end?
Hey, Kathleen, Mark here. Yeah, I mean, to the extent it does not pertain to one of the topics or initial scope items that Bob has up here, then go ahead and ask.
Yeah, okay, great, thanks. So one of the questions I had was if we, going through this working group, if we could discuss these items separately, but I also mean both, I guess, for the integrated forward market versus RUC. And I think that kind of ties into what you heard a little bit earlier, which is why I jumped in, but I had intended to ask for it when we got to this section initially. So that was just my request kind of going forward, if we could start mapping some of these discussion points between the 2 different processes.
Okay, so in capturing these scope items, we will specify, you know, whether it applies to quote unquote ISM or RUC. Is that what you're seeking?
Yeah, sure. Whatever format works. I think that the high level conversation, we need to talk about ISM and then we need to talk about RUC, and we will probably land on different principles for different processes because they have different roles. Is all in flagging.
Yeah, so today, as everyone's aware, ISM meets the bid-in load, whereas RUC meets the forecasted load. So I think some of the nuances and differences with EDAM will definitely get fleshed out in these scope items, Kathleen, and we'll definitely keep that in mind as we walk through that. Bob, your screen, at least on my side, appears to be pretty small. Christina, is that a Zoom feature on my side that everyone needs to apply?
Yeah, there is a little navigation bar on the left of the screen, so you can enlarge it on your end, or, you know, all the participants can.
Gotcha, thank you. All
Hey,
right.
Mark. This is Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. I had my hand raised too after Stuart's comment. I was wondering if the CAISO could respond. It sounds like from what he said was that there had been discussions about guiding principles and participation requirements that didn't make it into the guiding principles or get in the issue paper. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on what you meant, because I don't want to be disadvantaged and have, you know, participation requirements that everyone has in mind that I haven't heard of. It'll definitely inform the key market design here.
Yeah, so the common design principles and concepts document does lay out kind of that participation, commitment, voluntary participation. Are you looking more so kind of going back to Jeff's comment around 7,000 megawatts of load being bid in, you know, kind of that all or nothing concept?
I mean, I'm not even sure what I'm asking. It sounded like from Stuart there was something that didn't get into those documents.
Yeah, I think the point I was trying to make, there was obviously some discussions with folks in coming to the principles. There was some context to that, and some background that may have been helpful, because we had the initial issue paper that was issued by CAISO, and it's morphed into 3 working groups that are a subset of what was initially discussed. And I was just trying to get some context around how we arrived at some of the principles. I think that would be helpful for the other participants, because clearly there's discussions around things like there is a must-offer obligation, but it hasn't made it to the principles, but that's an important concept. I'm sure there's others. There was some mention of base scheduling not being used, which I understand from a generation perspective, but from a utility perspective, how we actually ultimately going to track all these transfers and tags, I'm not clear on. So there's contextual stuff that was discussed and agreed upon that was then filtered into the principles. And I just wondered if there was a broader document or even an update to the issue paper that would have been helpful for others that weren't party to those discussions. That was just my request.
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. I would find that really helpful if the CAISO could update a document or even throw out a few slides about the context that led to this. Especially if it was agreed to already by the EM entities, it would be helpful to know their position, because how do you talk about resource sufficiency if you don't know what you're being sufficient to? Being sufficient to what? Participation rules.
All right. I know we have Milosh on the line. Milosh, do you mind chiming into Carrie and Stuart's comment?
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. This is Milosh with the ISO. I think, Stuart, what you may be referring to in terms of an issue paper is that earlier version of an issue paper back from 2019, maybe, when this initiative originally started.
Yeah, that's correct, Milosh. That's correct, and it was pretty broad in scope, and then since then the scope has been narrowed, and then even the working groups themselves, the scope of the working groups has changed to what we have today. So there was some progress made, and I'm sure some consensus amongst the folks that were party to those conversations that led to the principal documentation. And I'm just wondering if it makes sense to try and update that and realign it with the new working groups as we set into these new discussions. That would just make sense to me, but it may not make sense to you.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Stuart. Yeah, and so we did not publish an updated issue paper, at least for the restart of this initiative, and the scope items remain fairly similar. I think we outlined them in the November workshop. There was not really a narrowing of scope items. It was, I think we acknowledged that the principles did not necessarily address the full breadth of issues that EDAM needs to address. I think we simply, the group that worked on these principles, partially ran out of time, but also focused on some of the more meaty issues themselves. But there's a recognition that beyond these 3 stakeholder working groups, there are also other topics that I think we outlined in that November workshop that are consistent as well with the issues that were addressed in the issue paper back in 2019 that will be part of that straw proposal. It's just that we're focusing these 3 stakeholder working groups on those key core items of the EDAM, but there will be, as part of that straw proposal, there will be proposals on other elements that are not part of this working group. So I don't think that the entities that worked on these principles focused on any outside or other materials, and by all means, I don't think that the principles necessarily represent a consensus on all of the elements. They just represent a consensus on these high-level principles. And then as we get into these discussions and more detailed design items, I think that's where really the robust perspectives will come in from other stakeholders. As you can see, some of these principles, they did not delve into too much design detail, but leaving that rather for these working group discussions. So what I envision ultimately will happen is the outcome from these working groups, as well as our work on the other items that are not necessarily part of these working groups, will be part of that broader straw proposal that will come out in mid-April, where that will be also subject to stakeholder comment and review. I don't know if that answers your question, but there's nothing, and I'll let Kevin and others jump in that worked on these principles. But we didn't rely on any other materials or build any other content beyond the principles at this stage, recognizing there will be additional work that needs to be done, and devil is in the details.
No, that's fine, Milos. I take it nothing's going to be updated. That's okay. We can just press ahead.
Let me just say real quick, because it probably bears at least a 2-minute discussion on kind of how we got to where we got to. The EIM entities way back were working on this proposal and, had their own concepts that we were developing. As you know, there was a straw proposal that the CAISO released. It all started way back in February of whatever year we were in. I can't even remember anymore now. So forgive me on that, but maybe 19 or 20, forgetting a lot of these weird COVID years. But anyway, we started at a point and we were working in various discussion groups among EIM entities. CAISO had its proposal it put forward, and I would say that, we had some general common concepts that we agreed on, but there were a lot of details and things that came out of the CAISO's proposal that we would probably say weren't workable from our perspective. And we continued to work on some kind of key design principles that we thought, the details would need to be fleshed out. And then we hit August of 2020. That's one year I remember. And that was it, man. We just hit the wall, and the entire EDAM idea concept just got stuck on ice because there was no point in pursuing this. We had, blackouts and all kinds of major issues to deal with. So everything kind of lost focus. And it was this last summer where it was decided, let's, instead of, we're moving through these issues related to August of 2020 and those events, let's start talking about EDAM again. Let's start looking at regional collaboration and moving forward. And it was in that spirit that we started discussing this again around these higher level design principles. So frankly, I think a lot of the opportunity that exists here is that there aren't any, hard and fast other than these principles, which are subject to reevaluation as well. Nobody is stuck in any deep details. I mean, we're talking RUC IFM. We never talked about this distinction, and I think it needs to be discussed, but I partly get a little lost on some of that relevance as far as from the EIM entity perspective. So, but I just think it's important to kind of recap that, we had not had a lot of time, and we did not try to tease out detailed design issues. I think we started with a principle, and I think we need to get into proof of concept. I mean, can this thing cohesively stand as a proposal? I think all of us still have questions that we need to address, and so this is going to be a great discussion. But I feel like, that's part of why there's some omissions here, Stuart, and minds like yours are going to be hugely valuable because you think in those levels of granularity and detail that we never really had a chance to get to because of other extraneous events that kind of put this thing on a side burner for a while.
It's helpful, Kevin. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin.
So, Mark,
go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. Is there other questions? I just, I'm thinking it might be useful to actually carry out this exercise. I think we had planned here was to go through the scope items and take any edits that the stakeholders might have, and it might answer some of these questions that are coming up.
Absolutely. And I don't see any other hands in the queue, so I think this is a good segue to kind of dive in here. And again, we're looking for feedback. We're looking for other items that need to be added or modified on this list. On the right-hand side, you will see the detailed market design questions that the ISO team had, things that they want to kind of get addressed and considered throughout these working groups. If we can walk through these items, vet each one, and really come up with a comprehensive list of items that this working group needs to tackle here in the next hour, that would be fantastic. To the extent we need to continue this conversation this coming Wednesday, we can do that. So with that, let's jump in, right? So one of the items, what resources qualify for showing within the EDAM RSE, right? And on the right here, you can see some of the questions that internally we propose. Does this include demand response, firm energy purchases, WSTP Schedule C? What level of information, as it pertains to this question, do you think this group needs to vet out? And let me pause there to see if anyone is willing to raise their hand and comment on this specific item. I see Tong. Go ahead.
Hi, this is Tong Wu from WAPA. First, I have a few questions. Now we have EIM. EIM basically is a real-time market. The benchmark or the reference point for EIM is the base schedules. So in this EDAM effort, so it's extended day-ahead market, is the goal try to find the base schedule basically, or we want to somehow change EIM, do more than that? That's one question. Let's assume if the goal is for this EDAM market is try to find the base schedule. If that's the case, are we saying we're asking what resources qualify to meet the base schedule load? So that's the second question. That may answer the question whether we want to meet a ROC schedule or IFM schedule, because if the goal is to meet base schedule, then it's not going to be the ROC schedule. So that's my question. And also, when we say showing, are we talking about resource adequacy showing or resource sufficiency showing? In my mind, there's a big difference between resource adequacy and resource sufficiency. Resource adequacy, we're talking about long-term planning, long-term installed capacity. But for resource sufficiency, we're talking about meeting the load for the next day. So that's quite different. So there are three questions, basically, yeah.
Thank you, Tong. And I'm actually going to see if Dani Johnson's willing to address those three inquiries.
Thanks, Tom. So I think on the last question you offered, the RSE would look to test if each entity can meet their forecasted demand plus some quantity of uncertainty in the day-ahead time frame. That's why we don't want it to set RA requirements. RA kind of does feed into eventually what the EDAM RSE will be testing. And I think, as somebody pointed out earlier, eventually those two may harmonize a little bit, but they are separate. RA likely is RA is on a much longer time frame. Ideally, would have much higher targets than your next day forecast for the vast majority of time. So I want to make that clear. Getting back to some of the earlier questions you asked, I think thinking about this in terms of base scheduling is probably not appropriate. The way I view this is the EDAM will produce a day-ahead schedule that would then be funneled into the EIM, similar to what the CAISO currently, or how the CAISO currently participates in the EIM. That day-ahead schedule is the initial reference point going into EIM. All of the schedules will be settled, unlike in EIM and the base scheduling process where just the imbalance from that base schedule would be settled. Did I answer? I know you had 3 questions, but I kind of blurred the first 2, I think. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, you kind of answered the question, but maybe my question was not clear. When I said that the goal is try to find the base schedule, I was talking about the day-ahead schedule, final day-ahead schedule. Today, I don't know what other party, do, but for bank or for WAPA, we have load forecast, and we try to line up resources to meet the load forecast. That is the base schedule before we participate in EIM. But that is the schedule, not really load forecast, because load forecast can change in real time. So that's
okay, so
additional forecast.
I think I understand. And I think we might be just conflating terms a little bit. I think that the EDM process would give you a settle that you would use and plan to operate to as you move into real time. I guess I'm a little sensitive to that base scheduling terminology since in the context of EIM, it has a really specific meaning about only having the imbalance energy settled off of it. So I think that the goal of EDM, you're correct, is to have that operating plan and that schedule that you'll move into real time with. But I just wouldn't call it a base schedule coming out of EDM.
Okay. Now, my other question, I don't remember. I thought that for day-ahead market, you have to schedule 95% of your load forecast. Otherwise, you're considered under scheduling. There's some penalty that goes with that. Maybe that has changed. Do you know?
Offhand, I don't know if we currently have a minimum requirement. Does anybody else on the panel?
Well, we can take that back and see if we can get it answered internally here.
So here, when we say qualify for showing, we mean qualify for showing enough supply resources to meet the day-ahead schedule.
No, so for this, Tom, for this particular item, this is simply what items do we need to, so we know we need to define what resources, what types of resources, what technology of resources qualify to be counted towards the RSE requirement, right? We haven't defined that RSE requirement. That's something that we're going to do. But for this particular item right here, is there anything else not captured here that we need to take into consideration when we think about what resources actually qualify to be accredited towards a entity's day-ahead RSE showing?
Okay, so RSE has not been defined yet. My assumption was that is their load forecast or their load schedule, or the maximum quantity of their day-ahead bid.
Yeah, I mean, there's load plus uncertainty and things like that. And Dani, do you want to comment on how we envision the RSE requirement fleshing out?
Yeah, I think the RSE will test for some forecast, some agreed upon forecasted demand plus uncertainty native to each EAA area. And so what we're trying to tease out here is what type of supply would qualify to count towards meeting that obligation.
Okay, I got you. But there, I think there are kind of 2 requirements. One requirement is just to meet your load plus some uncertainty. Let's say if you say 15%, if your load is 100, it's going to be 115. You have to line up resources to meet that demand, all kinds of resources. It could be generation, could be import, or could be some contract. And another aspect is that you need flexible resources, flexible capacity, or price-sensitive bid to meet the net short. Let's say I have 100 megawatt of load. Now this for now, just forget about the uncertainty, just for the purpose of illustration simplicity. Let's say I have 100 megawatt of load, and then I have 80 megawatt of supply, including generation, import, maybe some contract IST. Then I have a 20 megawatt of net short, but let's say if I meet the RSE, I may have 20 megawatt of a price sensitive bid, and the price can be higher than market so that you can optimize. But you need that price sensitive bid. So the ISO has something to optimize. So that might be additional aspect of this RSE. So for somebody to provide that price sensitive bid, certain resource can provide and some of resources cannot. So that may be a consideration. That's not a question, maybe it's a comment.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I think we might be, again, conflating this a little bit. Right now we're talking about how the IFM within EDAM would clear. I think what we're looking to do here is just figure out what supply counts towards meeting an entity's obligation. Are you suggesting that we need to potentially consider price responsive demand bids as part of the supply stack that each entity would be able to offer?
Yeah, I think probably you have total capacity to meet the demand plus some uncertainty. That's one aspect of it. And the other aspect of it is you have a price sensitive bid. Maybe the price sensitive bid is somehow a form of flexible ramping, or either a superset or subset of flexible ramping.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd like some other participants on this call to weigh in. Like the RSE is trying to test, does each entity bring enough supply into the EDAM to meet their own obligations? To the extent that we have price sensitive demand bids in EDAM, I'm not sure that there would be, or I'd like other participants' input on if we think that should qualify as being part of the supply stack and that entity being resource sufficient.
All right, do we have anybody? I see a few hands in the queue. I don't know if those are in, I saw yours there earlier, Kathleen, so I don't think that's in response to Dani's request. Jeff, did you want to weigh in on Dani's comment?
Yeah, I'll just share my thinking as Jeff Nelson from SCE again, and again, there's a lot of details to be worked out and we didn't nail things down in principle, but the sufficiencies in my mind has always been based on a forecast of what your load's going to be and set on based on a load forecast. If someone had the ability for responsive demand, it seems like that would be sort of bid in more as a supply resource, where if it was needed, those resources could be called on. So you'd actually, that's how I see it. And just one other sort of clarification. We talked about I talked about resources participating in the day-ahead market. You bring everything. That doesn't mean that all the resources would have a must offer. It just means to be part of the market. Like in the ISO's market today, all resources participate in the market, but only resource adequacy resources have a must offer. The others are participating at their discretion. But any transactions they do through self-scheduling or whatnot in the day-ahead time frame are going to clear through the market. So sorry to clarify that one.
No, thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Jeff. And I was actually going to reach out to you for that. So let me take a step back, because I think all these detailed questions and conversations we're having is really getting into the details. What we want to do here is agree that these items are really the appropriate scope items for discussion, right? So I think we can all agree, what resources qualify to meet RSE is definitely a scope item. And at a high level, kind of going back to an item Tong mentioned, are there any other items we need to take into consideration that's not already captured here?
And Tong, I have added some items under this consideration includes in the detail here to capture, I think, some of the things you suggested. So let me know if there's something else I need to capture. And I think to Mark's point, we're not trying to make a decision here. We're just trying to capture the scope.
But should it really just be summarized as demand response, and some discussion needs to be had as to how demand response is treated, the flexibility component and those other components, I don't know if meet the definition of a resource, so maybe you might not want to include it, I don't know.
Thank you, Stuart. And that was Stuart from LA for everyone else. Carrie, I'm gonna go to you. I've seen your hand has been raised for a while now. Thank you for your patience.
Oh, Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. I just wanted to identify, I think the conversation about this fleshed out additional scoping items around participation and the difference, defining the difference between a must offer and the base schedule. And everything Bob said, I think actually deserves its own core design decision. I was wondering, Bob, if you captured that, not within this, but as additional topics to discuss.
Well, I've been capturing some notes here separately.
I got that. I captured that, Bob.
Okay, great. Yeah, because I think each of those, what are the participation requirements? What are the participation requirements for load, for supply, for IFM, for RUC? Each should be its own issue, kind of above this RSC. And then I think everything will fall into place a lot cleaner. Thanks.
So, Carrie, are you stating that you feel the participation, in order to have the appropriate, kind of going back to what Milosh had set the grounds for around the purpose of this working group around RSE, that the participation requirements is necessary to get at least a initial, how we envision that working, what's required to participate, and what that looks like to have a robust discussion around RSE?
I do. I think that absolutely needs to be upfront. And I guess this is falling back too on what Kathleen said. She had assumed that we would answer these for IFM and for RUC. But how do you say what qualifies in terms of bidding, in terms of existing, in terms of counting, unless you already have your participation decisions at least somewhat made or even defined?
Okay. Yeah, I think in the context of RSC, I definitely agree with you on that.
Thanks.
And then I will, if you guys don't mind lowering your hand after, commenting, I'd appreciate it. Kathleen, I see your hand up. Go ahead.
Thanks. And I had my hand up earlier, but Carrie took half of what I was going to say. So thank you, Carrie. I cannot agree with this. Kathleen Colbert from Vista. I cannot agree with Carrie more. I was going to say there are at least two scope items above these. The first one being, I think she framed it well. I guess the question in my mind is, with the IFM and RUC, and just to provide context for why I think the higher level question, not so much the implementation details, it's the high level question of, well, is any type of RSE test necessary in the IFM, or is it only necessary in the RUC? Like, I want to have that conversation with this group, not necessarily today, but give us time to think about it. Maybe we talk about it at the next meeting. I think that is consistent with in the category of what's the participation requirement. So if you could fold that specific question in there, that would be great. My second one is, I also want to have the conversation about, are all of the tests necessary first? So balancing tests, bid range capacity tests, and flexible ramp tests. Can we talk through each of those? Once we kind of set the initial groundwork of IFM versus RUC, okay, then let's move to, okay, now we have the three different types of tests. They test for different things. And what are the concerns that we have in the IFM versus RUC? Maybe we share that all of them need to be tested. I just think that that's a scope item. That's the second scope item that we need to talk through. And then once we make those determinations, that these specific questions are actually not only relevant, not only do we have to ask it on an IFM or a RUC level, you need to ask it on, okay, for the IFM bid range capacity test, what X, Y, Z? For IFM flex ramp test, what is this question and its answer? I just think those first two questions, without going through that, I will struggle through all of these questions because I have those, the matrix in my head that I'm seeing of, well, which process are we talking about and which test? So that would be super helpful if we could level set on the next meeting with kind of those big picture questions.
Thank you.
So
we'll
Kathleen,
make note of that. Go ahead, Dani.
Offer a couple initial thoughts. The way I've thought about this is that the RSC should test that each entity in RUC could meet their forecasted demand plus uncertainty. So we have that reliability aspect of clearing an expanded day-ahead market. So I think that the RUC process would probably need some type of capacity and flexibility test. Regarding testing what is in the IFM, I think that's still an open question. My thought was it would be similar to the way that the current IFM is structured, and people could bid in their demand, and then RUC would serve as the backstop for that process. Maybe there does need to be some type of balancing test within that. I think that that's something that we can discuss, but we'll take this back and give it more thought, and I think next working group can have further discussion on this.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Dani, and I want to be transparent. I'm not offering any kind of position on it. I need to think these are complex stuff. I'm still thinking, we're all thinking through it, and so saving some space for that at the next meeting would be super helpful. But I appreciate your thoughts, and I'll noodle those things.
All right, so I do see we have a few more hands up. Tong, we've already heard from you, so I'm going to go to Jeff, and then I'm going to kind of move on with some of these scope items. And again, the purpose of this discussion is to ensure we are considering and agreeing on the appropriate scope items so that in later working groups, we can dive into all those details that we, kind of naturally are doing already. Go ahead, Jeff.
I'm sorry, are you calling on Jeff Nelson?
Jeff Spires, sorry.
Oh, okay.
Sorry about that. Sorry, thanks, Mark. It's Jeff Spires with PowerX again. You're just listening to the discussion there with Dani and Kathleen. I do think there's a benefit of in a future meeting taking a step back and talking about the kind of what do we think we're testing for at a high level, and what even in a simplistic way might that look like. I know that in a lot of the previous discussions we've had about resource sufficiency, we've thought about it as an upfront test before the market. So it's not so much about IFM or RUC. It's really about what is the amount of supply that each BA is bringing to the day-ahead market in a general sense, and is it enough, as Dani pointed out, to meet the load forecast plus some agreed upon level of uncertainty. So I think having a higher level discussion around what we think we're testing for and whether there's kind of a simple way to conceptualize that would help guide the more detailed discussions about, okay, now that we've done that, what goes into the test, et cetera, and what are the details around it. But the comment I was intending to make before that was just in the more detailed list here. We were talking about the first one around what resources qualify, and just to add to that list, one thing that we haven't really raised, but I think is really important and something that we're grappling with in the context of the EIM is striving for accuracy, what resources qualify and at what level. And so, examples of some of the criteria there are making sure that you can identify the resource, that it's a real resource and where it's located. You have some measure of its ability to perform so that if it's showing a quantity in the resource sufficiency evaluation, there's comfort that it can perform to that level if it's dispatched. To the extent that resources in other BAs are being used to meet resource sufficiency in your BA. Is that supported with an E-tag, or how do you know that you've got the supply and transmission available? All of those details, I think, are important in determining a common metric to say what supply should count, and how do we all feel confident that it's being counted accurately and that we're avoiding challenges like double counting and some of those other things that might start to get pretty complicated if we don't get that right.
So Jeff, outside of, resource specificity, we do have an item, I think it's on the next page, around resource characteristics and associated constraints. And I think that kind of captures the second component of what you were just mentioning.
Mark, do you think it might be helpful to just run through these high-level questions, or at least capture, the issues, so everyone can see all the items?
No, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I do want to move on and continue on this, conversation around what other scope items are we missing that needs to be discussed in this group, and any, subcategory for these particular items, right? So the next item here is, what is the expected granularity and detail of the EDAM RSC, right? Is it at the hourly level, forecasted demand plus imbalanced reserve allocation? Is there an easier way to do this? And then really this is where we're going to try to define that context of leaning. All right. Dani, did you want to add anything else there? Any other context before I move on?
Nope. Thanks, Mark.
All right. Thank you. All right. So again, kind of going back to what makes up that RSC requirement, right? What role does AS play from an obligation standpoint for each entity? Will AS be required in the EDAM RSC showing? Is that something we're going to want to account for to avoid any type of, potential double counting of capacity? Dani laid out a few other, subcategories here. What does zonal AS look like in the EDAM construct? I do know from an AS optimization standpoint, that's not something we're looking to immediately roll out. That's definitely further down the line, so I don't want to get into co-optimization between AS and EDAM itself. Dani, I'm going to pause at each one of those, at each item, to see if there's anything else you wanted to add.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I think the idea here is just for these transfers to be reliable, each EAM entity or each EDAM participant would have to have some level of commonly agreed upon AS that would be able to back those transfers coming from their BAA. This is a different paradigm than EAM, which specifically stays away from AS. So we just kind of wanted to point this out and get participants to start thinking about how AS will be included within EDAM.
Thank you, Dani. All right, Bob, you mind going to the next page? All right, another scope item to consider. How will the EDAM ensure the reliability of and confidence in EDAM transfers? Again, this kind of gets, Dani covered it just briefly there, interaction with AS, but then kind of going back to, I believe it was Michelle Keto in the beginning when we were talking about principles, priorities, right? What rolls over to EIM as a result of EDAM? What level of confidence can other entities account for? I know this is going to be a big one from a prioritization standpoint, any operation conditions, any emergency events, things like that. We understand we need to address each of those in those detailed conversations, but is there anything else from a confidence and reliability of these EDAM transfers that we need to consider for this particular scope item that we may be missing here? I see Kathleen with her hand up. Go ahead, Kathleen.
Hi, this is Kathleen from Vistra. It's actually back on the AS one. I have a clarifying question, and this is for Dani, I think. Is what you were saying is that each EAA is operating their area to maintain a specific amount of reserves. The CAISO needs transparency into that. So what's the mechanism that EDAM would support to give that transparency to the CAISO? Is that what you're asking?
I think I'm thinking about this more in the context of the RSE should test that each entity has surplus supply necessary to meet those AS obligations, so that once the EDAM is run, the result of it could be backstopped.
Okay, I think that's how I might just be thinking about it from the opposite direction of you kind of set up your target, the prior one, with a forecast of demand. So even if the CAISO makes it for the EIM area or the EIM area makes it, the EIM area could provide its AS amount, and that could be included in the target.
Yeah. I think we're just trying to figure out is there a common understanding of how that AS target is derived, because we want this test to be applied equally to all participants, and to the extent that one entity has carries additional reserves for whatever reason, would it be reasonable that they fail the RSE if their reserves as compared to their load are greater than other entities? It's working through those details.
Okay, so if it's all right, so what I think I heard you say was kind of two separate questions. How do we get to the AS component of the target in a way that is kind of consistent across the areas? And second, what's the failure consequence if that portion is not sufficient?
I think the first one is definitely, I would agree. The second one, I think that's something that we can open up for discussion. To me, at least, if an entity wasn't able to meet that commonly agreed upon AS plus demand plus uncertainty, then they would probably be resource insufficient, but I'd like to hear from others.
Cool, just trying to understand the questions. Thanks.
All right, so I see Rosemary Jones in the queue. Go ahead. You may need to unmute, Rosemary. All right, I no longer see Rosemary in the queue. Michelle Quito.
Hey, this is Michelle Quito from the CPUC. Just two questions. One question is, I haven't really thought through this, but how would the AS work on wheel-through transactions and also just the heavy imports and exports? Like, does the intermediate balancing authority carry them, or does how do you determine who needs to carry the AS on those? If they're really wheeling transactions or if they're sort of pseudo wheeling transactions?
I think, Michelle, that's a detail that we need to figure out. We're just trying to identify and capture the scope items of what we need to work through. So I think we'll reserve trying to work through that till a future date.
So maybe we just put a question in there, like, how do you determine which BA holds the AS? And then my other question is, this is sort of another just sort of scope issue. How does this interact with intertide deviation settlements? So it's a question, we don't have to have the answer, but it seems to me that we have to sort of think through that, right? Like, do intertide deviations no longer apply because they'll be in the EDAM, and so you'll settle them if they fail? So just a thought.
Thank you, Michelle. We'll definitely capture that.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. All right, so in the interest of moving on, and Kathleen, I don't know if you still have a question or if your hand raised back up, but let me read a few more of these topics, and then I'll absolutely come back to you. And I see you as well, Tom. All right, so moving on, what are the characteristics of the 45-day ahead advisory showing, right? What is the intent of this showing? Something I called out earlier, what level of details does this showing need to include, right? How specific do we need to be? What are What does that template look like? Those are all details we're going to work out in this working group. What is the timing of conducting the day ahead RFC, right? Does the stakeholder community envision seeing that executed at, say, 9 a.m. and you only get one run at it? Or are we, kind of going to how we do it in EIM? You get a few iterations of that test so that you know where you're falling prior to market close. What resources qualify for showing within the EDAM RSC for the purpose of passing the capacity test? And then lastly, what level of ramping verification is the EDAM RSC expected to possess? These are all topics that we understand and know we need to work out and further vet with the community, but is there any other topic or key market design element that we feel we need to add to this list? Tong, let's pause there, Bob, and see if I can get Tong. I've seen he had his hand up for a while. Go ahead, Tong.
Yeah, I got two questions. One question is about AS. Now, since all different BAs are obligated to have AS to meet NERC requirement, why does the ISO need people to show that they have AS? If they fail NERC requirement. For all the firm import or export, they're backed up by the control areas or the BAs. They have to. So I don't know the context of the discussion about this AS. Is EDAM gonna procure AS, or ISO is gonna get AS from these different BAs and try to dispatch the AS in real time to actually activate AS? I don't know the context or what's the significance of having AS. And that's one question. The other question is related to the 45-day showing. Is that a showing of RA requirements, or is that a showing of RSE? Earlier, we discussed that RSE is not about RA requirements. It's about the next day's load forecast. 45 days in advance is hard to forecast what the load would be 45 days out. So I don't know how that would apply. And how is that related to must offer obligation? Are we going to have must offer obligation at all? The current must offer obligation is tied to RA, not RSE. It's related to like a annual peak. In August, what's your peak load? That's what you have to show for RA. I hope that's not what we're asking people to show, because that's be too much for RSE. So I guess that's 3 or 4 questions.
Yeah, so I will address the showing piece, and then I'll ask Dani to chime in on your AS comment there.
Okay.
So the showing, let's decouple that from RA, right? The advisory showing is intended to provide an indication of the progress for that particular entity in meeting their RSC in that month ahead time frame, right? We're going to define through this working group what that 45-day showing means, right? The principles talk about it being advisory, but there's several other details we need to work out. Again, what does that showing look like? How are we establishing those, I'm going to call it forecasted or obligation requirements 45 days out? Do we need to have a common methodology across the entire EDAM footprint? I think those are all details that we'll work out, but it is not coupled to, one's RA program, and it does not come with a MOO, right? Must offer obligation, as you mentioned, is, resource adequacy driven. So I want to definitely separate those. Dani, did you want to comment on the AS piece before I move on to Rosemary in the queue?
Sure, Tong, I think you're right. And the NERC requirement likely is going to be carried by all BAs who participate in EDAM. I think we're just thinking of this from the context of if people are meeting their NERC requirement, they should be able to show that capacity as part of being resource sufficient prior to participating in EDAM. To the extent that the stakeholder community thinks that that's not necessary, then I think that's something that we could potentially exclude from this at this time. I think, like we mentioned earlier, a long-term co-optimized AS would be something we'd look to do, and maybe at that point we'd revisit it. But for at least the RSC, our thought was people are meeting their NERC requirements. They should be able to show sufficient capacity to meet their NERC AS requirements and their demand obligations and their uncertainty as part of being resource sufficient.
Thank you, Dani. And just to clarify, you know, the 45-day ahead showing is RA-like. We understand there's differences in RA programs, and you know, as we work through this process, one day down the road, this may harmonize the two. So I wanted to provide that clarification. Kevin or Jeff, I know you were included in those early design principles. Kevin Smith, I see your hand up. Did you want to chime in?
Yeah, real quick. I think some of the thunder was already taken out, but I think this 45-day, the only analysis nexus between this and the RA is really just the days. And I think, you know, Jeff Nelson can talk to this as well, but I think as we were looking at it, you know, there's clearly, we have a plan, right? We all know where we're going. We know generally where our loads are going to be. And so this was an idea of just assuring some of the other folks who had RA obligations that, you know, we have a plan. And so it's not binding, and clearly it can change. Resources will come and go. You know, unplanned. There's all kinds of things that can occur in that 45 days. But I always say the most simple way for us to look at this RSE is, but for the EDAM, how are you going to meet your load obligations? So that's really what we're looking at, is just trying to establish some kind of transparency to the market that, you know, we are not leaning or waiting, playing rope-a-dope to the, you know, day ahead and scrambling to find a way of meeting our load, and then ultimately, you know, potentially leaning on the market. So that's what this is. There's no there. This was nothing that we really discussed as a group prior to the summer. But I do think it's not an onerous obligation in my mind on the EIM entities. I think it provides a level of transparency and a little layer of certainty that we're in this to ensure that we can meet our obligations. On the other piece, just as a general concept, again, you know, nothing in this, just like EIM, is intended to change, amplify, or, you know, alter the obligations of the individual balancing authorities. We are all regulated, as Tom said. I agree with him. We're obligated under NERC rules and reliability standards, and so nothing here changes my obligation. That's why the no leaning is so, you know, obvious, because we're all supposed to be able to stand our markets up on their own and meet all of our load serving NERC obligations, irrespective of the EDAM market. And the EDAM doesn't add or change those obligations. Bank is a BA. It's going to have to meet its obligations with or without the EDAM, as is APS and SRP and Idaho and all the others that would be and the CAISO. So just to clarify that this is not intended to, again, you know, change those obligations, which are independent of the EDAM.
Thank you, Kevin. I appreciate that context and background. Bob, if you don't mind going to the next page, I do see we have more callers in the queue. Okay, so we do have, we have a few other items. So I want to do a time check, team. We're at 2:43. I would like to maybe get through a few more of these items, and then we'll go back to the line here. So I appreciate your patience. So in terms of other scope items that need to be considered, how detailed should the resource characteristic constraints be modeled, right? What granularity are we going to get down to in that? we have a few items here. Do we model the daily energy limits, start limitations, think about MSG ramifications and things like that. Moving on, what informs the requirements that entities will have to meet to pass the EDAM RSE? Who's responsible for that forecast? What's the appropriate treatment of existing reserve sharing group obligations? What is the appropriate treatment for non-conventional resources and imports without firm transmission in the day-ahead time frame? Going back to respecting those WSPP Schedule C arrangements. Again, going back to the core principles, we're not looking to conflict with other RA programs out in the West. So what level of consideration do we have there? What are the appropriate failure consequences for the EDAM RSC? Is it going to be freezing of transfers for that particular hour, for the day, limiting participation? Is that sufficient? Is there any punitive financial consequences for a failure? Those are all things we need to consider, think about, and work through. And then lastly, to the extent the footprint has insufficient supply to meet demand, what outcomes are expected? Let me pause there. I saw Jeff earlier in the queue as well as Rosemary. So Rosemary, let me go to you first. I've seen your hand up quite a bit and it keeps dropping, so I want to make sure I address your comments. Okay, I see your comments there in the chat. Thank you, Rosemary. And it's really around the discussion and definitions regarding AS types. Kathleen, I see your hand up. Go ahead. You're on mute, Kathleen. All right. We do not hear you, Kathleen, to the extent you had a comment. So with that, let's move. Oh, there she goes. Go ahead. Oh, you're doing the mute and unmute. I hear you now. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry. No, technical difficulties. Apologies. No, I just wanted to make a request on the advanced showing element scope item.
Sure. Yeah, so up one more page, Bob.
Yeah, thank you. So my request would be, can we make this scope item more general? Like I just called it advanced showing. So could we just refine it to what are the characteristics of the advanced advisory showings? I think one of the questions, so a couple of questions that we should add to the detailed questions are, what's the appropriate timing for that? What's the appropriate application for that? And when I say application, I really mean, like, in my mind, it's cyber. And
yeah, so from a, I hear you, Kathy, but from a policy standpoint, I don't want to necessarily dive into or specifying which app we should be applying, right? I think it's more important to define what does that template look like, and we'll let the technical team drive what application makes most sense for that.
That's fair, and I will hold for to delve too far into, but I will share with you my gut reaction on this, and why I'm asking to make the key market design question more general is, you can submit offers 7 days in advance of the operating day through cyber. So what application is kind of important. I don't see any reason for it to ever be sooner than that as of right now. So I think it's a demonstration for why something so far in advance is needed, would need to be provided to provide support for something like that. But I also think it's really critical for us to keep in mind that there's generators in the EIM that are not within the EIM entity itself. We also need to be mindful of the non-EIM entity-owned generators and making sure that whatever application, if they're going to be counted in an advanced showing, is not overly burdensome. So just keeping in mind those things is really important for this topic.
Understood. Thank you. I appreciate your comments. All right, Bob, do you mind scrolling back down? I think we can skip a page because we walked through these items. All right. Last two. Should there be any linkage between EDAM and EIM RSC? And some of those questions, is the EDAM RSE an appropriate proxy for the EIM RSE capacity test? Would any elements or subset of EIM RSE apply to entities which pass the day-ahead RSE? How should outages between day-ahead and real-time be addressed? So those are some of the questions Dani had proposed that he would like to flush out. And I understand, given the time frame, others have a lot of thoughts, and I would encourage you to provide those scope items through that mechanism that Christina called out in the beginning. To the extent we haven't called on you, and you would definitely like to see, or for us to consider some additional scope items that need to be vetted in this working group, and then we could provide that comprehensive list to all entities. That way it's clear on what's the scope for this working group versus the straw proposal itself. And then lastly, what are the interdependencies and implications associated with reserve sharing or RA programs forming in the West? So I know I walked through a whole bunch there. We have about 10 minutes here. So let's go to Dan Williams. Dan, do you mind unmuting your line?
Can you hear me okay?
I hear you okay, Dan. Go ahead.
Okay, good. Thank you. Yeah, Dan Williams from Customized Energy Solutions. I wasn't really sure where to just kind of put this on the table, but when Jeff from PowerX mentioned thinking about the RSE and the EDAM as a kind of pre-market check, it reminded me that I feel like we still really need a discussion of what market changes to expect with EDAM that extend sort of outside of it or set the context for it. And most specifically, just thinking about what we expect as far as forward trading on a kind of bilateral basis and an index basis, or trading at hubs, those sorts of things, sort of how we expect that to function. Like, do you think that there'll be sort of a 2-day ahead market that allows people to transact prior to the EDAM horizon, and then the EDAM kind of becomes an all-encompassing day-ahead market? Or does the CAISO intertime market still exist in the day-ahead timing or in the day-ahead time frame, but somehow separate from EDAM? I feel like some of those things kind of have to be a part of the discussion in order to get to the point of kind of counting and assessing positions, because I have a hard time foreseeing a future where the only resources that can be counted are the resources that are on your system or that are under a long-term RA obligation, just given that RA and RS don't line up perfectly as far as targets and confidence intervals and those sorts of things. So I try not to ramble with that too much, but that's kind of where part of my thinking was going. And then also thinking about maybe implications for the gas day and for different entities' hydro operations, and considering limitations and those sorts of things that all kind of play into the counting puzzle, but I guess start with a timing puzzle.
Yeah, absolutely. I do know we have, resource characteristics above as one of those items. Dan, Dani, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I don't think that we have good answers to a lot of those questions right now, Dan. I think partially it depends on how widespread the EDAM adoption is. If there's really widespread adoption, then the volume of bilateral trading between the day ahead and real-time time frame might be less. If there's not widespread EDAM adoption, that would still be in place in something like its current form. So I think that we need to, as this process goes on, kind of think through just what it looks like, or where we're at, and the type of support that we have from the different stakeholders in this process.
Okay, thanks.
All right, Stephen Pruitt.
Yeah, hi, Stephen Pruitt, Los Angeles. I haven't seen anything about the forecast that we're trying to match our resource sufficiency evaluation to. Should that maybe be a topic we need to come up with a mechanism by where we agree what forecast is being matched by the resources? Who's doing the forecast or who's submitting it? Does it come from the EIM entity, or is there a mutual forecast that is agreed to? And are there mechanisms if the forecast is chronically off to correct that?
Yeah, no, great point. So I do know we have one of the topics above was what informs the requirements that entities will have to pass the EDAM RSC, and part of the sub-questions there was who creates the forecast. So maybe we add some of those details there, Bob.
That sounds great.
Forecast accuracy, implications.
Right, and tuning in the forecast.
Right. And when you say tuning, are you looking for more of a common methodology across entities?
Not necessarily. Whatever mechanism we use to come up with a forecast for a particular entity, if it turns out that forecast is, say, chronically off by a couple hundred megawatts, there needs to be an adjustment made to get that corrected. But that might be unique to each entity. Because after the fact, you can see what the forecast was for their load, and you can see what they actually did. And if there's some pretty strong trends in there, there should be ways to fix that. And they should be done. They should be fixed. So that keeps everybody with accurate forecasts.
Thank you.
So Steve, this is Dani. I think at least thinking about this, if we use EIM as a model, I know the ISO optionally provides forecasts that could be used that inform the RSE. To the extent that an entity wants to provide their own forecast, then there's mechanisms in place to ensure that that forecast is accurate. So I think that would be an initial framework on which to look at this problem.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. Yep.
All right, we have 5 minutes. I'm gonna give Steve Greenleaf an opportunity to speak to the audience, and then we'll go ahead and see what's coming for this Wednesday, set the stage for Wednesday.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Steve Greenleaf, Brookfield Renewable. Can you hear me okay?
We hear you loud and clear, Steve.
Okay, great. Two hopefully quick questions. One somewhat process related, and I'm not quite sure how it works today in the EIM, but for entities that have load serving obligations, and forget CAISO for a minute, outside of CAISO, obviously, I'm assuming as far as a lot of the requirements you're talking about, those are going to roll up to the EDAM entity, the BAA. As far as how any requirements roll down from that EDAM entity to sub-entities within their BAA, is that going to be part of this process, or is it going to be part of kind of parallel individual BAA stakeholder efforts to change the route? I hope that makes sense. But
so this is Dani. I think that the initial thought would be that this would be handled by entities through their OAT. The ISO does have a sub-entity scheduling coordinator function for EIM only. That's something that potentially we could look to expand at some point. However, given the truncated timeline we're trying to get this design done by, that might be a later item.
Okay. So in the first instance, look to the individual BAAs to the extent they're going to make changes to the road to roll down any kind of responsibilities to sub-entities. That's what I'm hearing.
Yeah,
right?
I think so.
Okay, thanks. The second question, can you go back briefly to AS, the list of issues on AS? And I thought, well, just confirm, I thought either you, Dani, or Mark, someone mentioned co-optimization of AS energy is, across the entire EDAM footprint is not on the table. Did I hear that?
I think
I'm not sure I saw it in writing, but
our initial thoughts are that probably isn't on the table with EDAM Go Live. However, it would be something that we would look to add on as an enhancement at a later date.
Okay. All right. So I guess EIM entities outside of CAISO would obviously, as Kevin and Tom previously stated, each BA has an obligation to maintain the necessary reserves. They would show that, but those wouldn't necessarily be bid in. Sorry, that's a basic question. I'm just trying to understand how that's going to work.
Yeah, I think we would want them to be showing that they have the ability or that capacity exists. I think beyond that is what we're trying to figure out through this working group.
Okay, so we're not talking about another, AS test as a sub-test to the larger resource sufficiency test.
I think that we would look to just have one resource sufficiency test that tests for the forecast, demand, the predicted AS obligations, and uncertainty.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Christine, if you don't mind going back to the presentation.
Not at all. Michelle, can you get me presenting right?
And for those who still had their hand up or would like to provide further comments, I would encourage you again to provide those through the link. So just a quick check-in. We went through a quick background review of the principles. We reviewed, made a few edits, and discussed the list of scope items. It is by no means a final list, so to the extent you would like to weigh in and provide more items for consideration, please do so. We didn't get to address the topics as it relates to, how we logically walk through those. So in Wednesday's meeting, I would like to, we had a few follow-up items earlier, but on top of that, I would also like to kind of pause, review the list of scope items, again, in the subcategory advisory showing, RSC itself, and certainty around EDAM transfers, and decide as a group which ones we would like to attack first, or tackle first, I should say. Really looking to build some momentum. I appreciate everyone's time. I do look forward to our conversations, and thank you all for your engagement today. With that, I want to respect everyone's time, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your afternoon.